Good evening. A lot of people here in York this evening, walking around looking for ghosts. Oh yes, we have lots of ghosts here in York, especially around Halloween. But here in York, a ghost is definitely not just for Halloween. We are the most haunted city in Europe, so they say. There's always a ghost or two about.
Nigel!
Hello!
I'm doing a live too!
Hello, how are you? Hello!
Right. Just photobombing you.
That's my friend Mackenzie there. Just a very good ghost tour herself.
And Nigel is a great ghost tour too.
Thank you. Nice. This old church here. This is St Michael the Belfry Church, where Guy Fawkes was baptised. And of course, next month we'll be lighting bonfires, setting off fireworks, and traditionally, if you still follow these things, burning Guy on top of a bonfire. Of course, here in York, well, he's a local lad, isn't he? So not everybody has been quite so keen on that last part. We don't tend to do it as much nowadays. Anyway, it's not very PC. But his old school just up the road from here, St Peter's, well, they never used to. In fact, they asked one of the old headmasters why once, and he said, well, we don't like to burn our old pupils. So they never really did. Now, it's not just Guy, of course, who was involved in the gunpowder plot. He didn't start the thing at all, no. Well, it was actually a man called Robert Catesby, and there were 13 conspirators. Guy was actually one of the last ones to join. But two of his schoolmates, John and Christopher Wright, well, they were, of course, involved in a plot too. So, out of all those conspirators, 3 of them went to school here in York. Tells you something, doesn't it, really? Now, of course, we're not proud of Guy and what he tried to do. He was, of course, trying to blow up Parliament and kill the king. There are some people, perhaps, who wish he had succeeded, but nevertheless, Guy, or Guido, as he chose to call himself, well, you know, he is a bit of a local celebrity even now. And just across the way, next to this beautiful church, we have the Guy Fawkes Inn, which claims to be the place he was born. There, well, might not be exactly the case. It's very good for tourism, of course, but actually there's a plaque on Stonegate just down the road which actually says he was born there. However, nonetheless, the Guy Fawkes Inn just across the way does very good food and drink, so it's worth popping in there. Now, there are those who say that Guy himself haunts the city of York, and whilst I would love to say that is the case, probably not. He may be one of the few people who doesn't haunt York. You see, he was hanged, drawn and quartered down in London. Now, just to describe that for your entertainment purposes, what they do is drag you to your place of execution, that's the drawing part, hang you by the neck, but not until you're dead, of course. That would spoil the next bit. And then, well, they basically chop you up. They cut you open to pull your guts out whilst you're still alive. Then they chop off your head, your arms and your legs, which is the quartering part, and they put your head on a spike. Now, his head was placed on Tower Bridge, given pride of place, so everyone can see it, of course. And his arms and legs were sent to different parts of the kingdom. It's said by some that we got an arm here in York. And we did put arms and other body parts under our gates and walls, of course, from time to time. Obviously, any relics of him have long since gone. But yes, being as he was killed in London, dismembered and bits of his body sent all over, it's probably unlikely he's actually still haunting the city of York at all. However, of course, we have plenty of other ghosts, so he, you know, is not that missed really. For example, down here we have the Dean Court Hotel. Now, Dean Court is a lovely old building. There used to be several old buildings back in the day. Various houses all knocked together. Said to be haunted by the ghost of a maid who walks around down in the cellars, of course. Now, one of the rooms upstairs often reports unusual activity as well. Strange noises are heard, and sometimes, of course, people report poltergeist-like activity even in that room, number 36. So if you do stay there, maybe ask which room they're going to put you in, you know. There is one story, of course, of a man who saw, reflected in a bathroom mirror, a man wearing a helmet who he described as being a Roman. Now, there have been many reports of Roman ghosts here in York, so possibly the case. After all, we are near York Minster, where the Roman legionary headquarters used to be. Who knows? But he's only ever been seen that once, as far as I can tell. Now, York Minster over there has a few ghost stories of its own. Think, of course, that being a church on consecrated ground, it couldn't possibly have a ghost or two, but well, it's had several reports over the years. One oft-told story was of a man called Dean Gale. He used to look after the building. He loved it a lot, of course, but then he died, unfortunately. But then the next Sunday, a man was giving a sermon, and he stopped, halted mid-sentence, and looked down in shock before recovering and managing to finish what he was saying. And afterwards, people asked him what happened. He said, well, I looked down and I saw Dean Gale sat in the pews smiling at me. So he loved the Minster so much, perhaps he didn't want to leave. Another oft-told story takes place in Victorian times. It involves a young woman who was on a tour around York Minster. Now, she'd wandered away from the rest of the group, and she saw a man in a naval officer's uniform looking at her. She recognised him, though, as her brother. She went to speak to him, and she stopped because he didn't look his usual self. He looked very serious and very pale. So, within arm's reach of him, she stopped, and he looked her right in the eye, and he whispered in her ear, "There is a future state," which might not mean anything to you, but it did to her. See, way back before, when they were young children, they'd made a bit of a pact. See, kids often talk about things that perhaps, they're not sure about, try and work things out, and they had a discussion about life after death. Was there a heaven and hell? I mean, they were told in church there were, but was that the case? And what about ghost stories? They'd heard those. Was that true? Who knows? So being children and simple childlike logic, well, they decided to find out. So they thought, well, simplest way is when one of us dies, they can come back and tell the other one. And they agreed on the phrase, "There is a future state." So they'd know, of course. Well, 20 years had gone by, and they'd long since forgotten about this kind of childish game. But then, they say your life does flash before your eyes, doesn't it? And well, perhaps that happened in his case. You see, when they got home, they found a letter from the Navy, and it said he died at sea, gone overboard, and the date and time of his death was stated there. It was the same date and the same time she'd seen him there in York Minster. So he'd returned to complete his final promise to his sister. Now, York has lots of pubs. It's one of the things we are famous for. It's not a bad thing to be famous for, really. They used to say we had a pub for every day of the year. It's not the case, if it ever really was, but we do have quite a lot. About 198 last time I checked, anyway. And if you look at the pub signs, sometimes they tell a bit of a tale. It's called the Three-Legged Mare, and there's a picture. It shows a tripod with some nooses hanging from it. That's what we called our gallows. There's a tripod, so you could hang at least 3 people at once. And it was up at the Knavesmire, which is where the racecourse is today. We called it the Tyburn of the North, as it was the largest execution site outside of London. And we hanged more people than anywhere else apart from London, of course, here in York. Now, one of the most famous people we executed here was the famous Dick Turpin, that great highwayman. Except he wasn't quite as people picture him. See, we've had all these images created in stories of a dashing dandy highwayman, a gallant gentleman of the road. Not much like the real Dick, I'm afraid. No, he was just a common criminal. Probably quite scruffy as well. See, he started out as a butcher's apprentice, and then he turned to poaching, and then, of course, eventually to robbery, and eventually murder. Not a nice man, quite a violent criminal, really. Only quite short as well. His face scarred with smallpox. So not a good-looking man. And a lot of the time he was sleeping rough, they say, in Epping Forest, just robbing passing travellers. Now, of course, this gets into a lot of trouble with the authorities, and so there's a massive reward for his capture. So Dick fled up north and changed his name to John Palmer to try and lay low for a little bit. And he made a living here selling horses. Not so bad a thing you might think, of course. But he didn't actually own any horses. No, he was stealing those, which of course is what we eventually executed him for. Yes, it was a hanging offence, that. So Dick Turpin was hanged at the racecourse on the 7th of April 1793. However, the man who hanged him was actually a former highwayman himself. Yes, a man called Thomas Hadfield. They actually met each other in passing, so they say, on the roads around London. The reason why a former highwayman was given a job of hangman is because, well, they didn't have a lot of people wanting a job of executioner, so condemned criminals could be given a job. So they hanged him, and of course then his body was laid out in the cellars of the Blue Boar Inn, and people paid a penny a time to come and see his body. So you could say he was still robbing people after death. But does he haunt the city of York? Well, maybe. See, there's quite a few pubs that say he does. The Blue Boar Inn, the Red Lion. But if you want my money, I'd say he may well actually still be haunting the Castle Museum. See, that was our prisons for a very long time, and a condemned man's cell and some of the other buildings around there definitely have lots of paranormal activity reported there. We've had lots of TV shows, paranormal investigators and all sorts of people going down there. So maybe in the condemned man's cell where he spent his final night before his execution, maybe that's where you should look if you want to find him. I don't know for sure, but I certainly wouldn't want to be the last person to turn the lights off there and make my way out on my own. Now this gateway here is Bouvan Bar. It's the oldest medieval gateway left in York. There's been a gateway on that site since Roman times. It's built right where the entrance to the Roman fortress used to be. They do say that even though most of it was built in medieval times, some of the stones they used might even be Roman as well, perhaps. Now, of course, lots of people like to pass through here, of course, and it's a beautiful old gateway. Sadly, it's not entirely complete. There would have been a Barbican sticking out here, which was demolished in 1835, which was an extra gateway into the city. So we had a tunnel with gates at this end, gates at that end as well. Barbican was defensive. A bit like an airlock, really. You could actually let somebody through the first set of gates without actually letting them into the city properly. Then, of course, you could interrogate them and find out who they were. But if you were an attacking army trying to get through, well, you had to get through the outer gates. And then, of course, lining up either side of the gates, you could have soldiers throwing stuff at you or shooting arrows or pouring boiling oil on you, and then you have to make your way through the other gates where the portcullis were over here before you could actually get into the city. Hello there. Hello. So yes, quite hard to get into the city of York back in those days, and we did need that sort of thing, of course, because we were attacked by many people. We were the medieval capital of the north, a key target, and one of the groups of people that attacked us were the Scots. Yes, Scotland. We haven't always seen eye to eye with the Scots, of course. Don't always even now, of course. But there's a scurrilous rumour that it's still legal to shoot a Scotsman here from the city walls of York with a crossbow. Not really. Of course, you know, you can't get away with that sort of thing. But back in the day, there's a certain historical basis for it. You see, obviously we were attacked quite a lot. And well, there wasn't really a professional army as such. So every free man of York was basically entitled to defend his city. So if you saw a man with a big sword and a kilt running at your walls shouting, well, yes, if you had a crossbow with you, more than entitled to shoot at him. You know, it's only wise. Of course, technically, they say it's never been repealed, so what can I say? Tells you something about York, doesn't it? So I'm just going to walk over to the art gallery now. Won't be very long. Bit of traffic tonight, of course. York's quite a busy old place. We're going to move across anyway. We should be fine. So we're going to head over here, see what's left of a big wall here and an archway. That's because where we are now was actually outside of the city of York. This was all part of St Mary's Abbey, once one of the largest and richest abbeys in the north of England. It stretched from this wall over here all the way down right to the River Ouse. It was vast, And the monks were very wealthy. Oh yes. These were not poor people, though of course they had taken certain vows and live a poor life. They owned lots of land. Oh yes. And with that came lots of money. And they didn't lead a bad life, really. They had their own brewery, they made their own beer, so not that bad, eh? Now, of course, Henry VIII, he broke away from the Catholic Church, started the Church of England, and had all the abbeys torn down during the dissolution of the monasteries. Basically, it was a land grab. He got to keep all the land and the money for himself. You know, worked out very well for Henry. Not so much for the monks. The building here is known as the King's Manor. It used to be the abbot's old house. You can see it's not a small building there. The abbot was, as I say, not a very poor man. And of course Henry had it enlarged. It was made fit for a king. In fact, you can see a coat of arms above the doors. Actually, that's the coat of arms of Charles I. And he's one of the many monarchs that stayed here. But back to Henry. Henry came here the last time in 1541, by which time he was on to wife number 5, Catherine Howard. Now, he obviously got through 6 wives. She was the penultimate wife. And you might remember the old story, you know, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So a quick way of remembering the wives. So Catherine Howard, well, you can tell what happened to her. Now, Catherine Howard was a young woman, only 18 years old, and by this point Henry was 50. And he weighed about 30 stone, could barely walk. He had gout, he had diabetes, he had running sores up and down his legs, and well, quite possibly syphilis, people say, as well. So he wasn't exactly love's young dream. If he wasn't the King of England, she probably wouldn't have looked twice at him, of course. But being the king, well, she couldn't really say no when he proposed to her. So she married him, perhaps not for love. Now, they do say that she may well have been having an affair with a man called Thomas Culpeper, who was staying there at the time, a man nearer to her own age. And you can't perhaps blame her for, you know, seeking love in the arms of another man who a bit closer to her own age. But Henry, of course, could. He could not be seen to be cuckolded. He was the king. So, of course, he had them both executed the following year. But they do say there is a ghost of a woman in Tudor dress who walks through that building there, holding roses. And, well, they do say that Catherine liked the rose garden that used to be here. Perhaps it's her. So they seem to say anyway. A bit further down, we have the beautiful Theatre Royal here. Now, this theatre first opened in 1744. It's been going ever since. It's had a Gothic Victorian makeover and a more modern makeover here, you see with all the glass bits here. But this is one of the longest continually operating theatres outside of London. Lots of famous actors have performed here, of course. But it's actually built above the ruins of St Leonard's Hospital. Now, basically this was run by the monks and nuns of the Abbey. And you can find parts of the ruins underneath there. Now, there is a story of a famous ghost, the Grey Lady. She was said to be a young nun, and she was living there, but she fell in love with a young man. They had an affair, and she got pregnant. And of course, this was a massive disgrace. She'd broken her vow of chastity. The Mother Superior was livid. She was outraged. And so, as punishment, they locked her in a windowless room and bricked up the door. Now, she died there, of course. But many people here, many actors and other people too, have reported seeing a ghostly grey figure in the upper dress circle there. And you might think, well, she'd be an angry, vengeful ghost, but no, it seems she's actually quite peaceful and actually a good luck charm for many actors. They say if you see her on opening night, you can have a really good show. Now, you might not believe this story, of course, but she has been immortalised as a gin from the York Gin Shop. It's called after her, so she does certainly live on as one form of spirit at least. Yes, it's a bad joke, I know. But definitely go and have a look around the Theatre Royal. You can see some of the old columns and things they found there. And they actually found written inscriptions scratched into the columns there, which they believe were partly from this woman there. So that's just a few of the ghosts that haunt York and a few of its stories. There are many, many, many more, of course. So if you do come to York, book a tour. Find out more about them. I do private tours, so it can be just you and your group. And I can pick you up at different locations as well. If you're staying in the centre of York, I can meet you at your hotel. And, well, you know, we'll take you around and we can customise the route if there's something particularly that you want to see or hear about. Have a good night anyway, take care, and hopefully nothing will go bump in the night for you.